Hi, I'm Randy Wise, curator at the Fremont County Pioneer Museum, and welcome to our second Wind River Visitors Council Adventure Trek. Normally we take folks live to interesting locations around the Lander Valley in Fremont County. Due to the unusual circumstances of this year, we're doing our treks, many of them virtually. This trek today, we're going to be talking about some of the historic houses of Lander. Now, we could talk about many different houses. Today, we're going to focus on a handful of interesting houses that we know some stories about. We're going to concentrate, for the most part, on houses that are still standing. There are lots of neat houses that were here but aren't anymore. So we're going to focus on the ones that are still standing, with one or two exceptions for that. So thank you for joining us, and welcome to Historic Homes of Lander. Almost all of the properties and homes we're going to be visiting today on our trek are privately owned. We would ask you to respect the homeowners and not trespass on their properties. You're certainly welcome to drive by and look at the homes, but we do ask you to respect private property rights and let folks enjoy their homes in peace. Thank you. We're standing in front of what is the oldest standing structure still in Lander. This is the Baldwin home, which was part of the Baldwin Trading Post complex. Major Noyes Baldwin was born in Connecticut, traveled to California during the California Gold Rush with his family. They traveled by boat around the Cape and ended up in California. From California, he moved to Nevada and ran a hotel. About that time, the Civil War broke out, and Baldwin raised a company of cavalry, the 1st Nevada Cavalry, and he was appointed as major of the cavalry unit. He kept that title the rest of his life. He was stationed at Fort Bridger in Wyoming Territory during the Civil War. After the war ended, he moved up into the Lander Valley, and this would have been about 1866, and became an Indian trader. He opened a trading post to trade with Native Americans. His first one was on the banks of the Poposia, just outside of today's Hudson, Wyoming. Not all of the Native Americans were friendly in those days, and there were a lot of conflicts, and Baldwin ended up moving to the Lander Valley and opening a trading post. About that time, 1868, 1869, the gold rush happened up at South Pass. So Baldwin also opened a trading post and a general store at South Pass City. And he traveled in between the two sites here in Lander, or the Lander Valley, and up to South Pass. His wife Josephine and his 4 children were left here to manage the trading post, while Baldwin was making the long journey in those days between the Lander Valley and South Pass. It was here in this little tiny cabin with 4 other children that the first white child in the Lander Valley was born. Baldwin's son George was born in 1869 in this small cabin right behind me. As Lander grew and became a thriving community, Baldwin settled here permanently. He left this little trading post that he had established here and moved into town. He built a very large stone structure at the corner of 3rd and Main, and that became the Baldwin store, which was a general store, carried a little bit of everything. And it was a butcher shop, clothing, farm goods, just about anything you could imagine Baldwin sold at his general store. He also built a very large and very nice frame home on South 2nd Street. That home is no longer standing, but Baldwin furnished it with the best he could get from St. Louis, Chicago, San Francisco. It was a very beautiful home on South 2nd Street. Like many Lander pioneers, Baldwin started in pretty humble accommodations, like the little cabin that's behind us, but did well and left this humble place and had a very nice home built in Lander. The wood was actually shipped in from Point of Rocks, which is south of here, and this was before the railroad, so the wood came in on freight wagons into the Lander Valley to build Baldwin's home. One of the interesting things about the Baldwin home, the Baldwin cabin, was the fact that when Major Baldwin moved here, the Shoshone were friendly to white Americans, but there were other Native American tribes that weren't particularly friendly. He was really the only family down here in the Lander Valley, and there were hostile Native Americans. So there aren't a lot of windows in this cabin, but there are gun ports in some of the walls. We're standing in front of the Eugene Amoretti Jr. house on North 3rd Street. The Amoretti name is very significant in Lander's history. Eugene Amoretti Sr. was an Italian immigrant who came to America, again for the California Gold Rush, ended up making his way to the South Pass area when that gold rush happened in 1868-69. And instead of being a miner, Amoretti was a merchant. He opened restaurants, general stores, mining equipment stores, and made a considerable amount of money as an entrepreneur. Amoretti's son, Eugene Jr., was the first white child who was born at South Pass City. As the mining boom ended, Amoretti looked down into the Lander Valley and decided Lander Valley would be a good place to become a merchant. And he moved down into the Lander Valley, opened a general store down here. He also opened the first bank in Lander. Amoretti was also involved in real estate. He was one of the founders of the town of Lander and owned a lot of property in here. And this area where we're standing was actually called the Amoretti Addition. And on either side of us is Amoretti Street and Eugene Street. So Amoretti got his name on a couple of streets here. His son, Eugene Amoretti Jr., built this house in 1917. And today it's been cut up into apartments, but in those days it was a very, very large house. His original home was down across from the lumber yard on North 2nd Street, and again in 1917 he built this house. Eugene was very interested in the cowboy lifestyle and actually enjoyed being a cowboy and a rancher. He ended up purchasing the EA Ranch outside of Du Bois. He bought it from a couple of cowboys, one of whom was actually Butch Cassidy, who owned that property. Butch worked for Eugene Amoretti Sr. as a ranch hand and ended up owning some property up around Du Bois. Eugene Jr. bought the property, turned it into a very large and very profitable dude ranch. They lived there as well, but the dude ranch became a popular destination for people from all over the country. And Eugene Amoretti lived there until he died in the 1920s. Eugene Amoretti also operated dude ranches in Moran Junction and at Jackson Lake. He was very conscious of the tourist dollar, and between his place in Du Bois and the places in Moran Junction and in Jackson Lake, he brought a lot of tourists to Lander very early on. Eugene lived at the EA Ranch until he died in 1950. We're standing in front of what is known as the Horniker Abbott House, which was built in 1884. Very interesting story behind this house because originally it was the county jail. So when Fremont County was created, it was created out of Sweetwater County. This was all part of Sweetwater County when this was Wyoming territory. There were only 5 counties. Sweetwater stretched from the northern border of Wyoming territory to the southern border of Wyoming territory. In the 1880s, Fremont County was carved out of that. Lander being the only town of any size in the whole county, and this county is the size of many eastern states, it became the county seat. So if the county seat, they need a courthouse, they need a jail, they need administrative facilities. There were 2 competing plans for the location to place the courthouse, one on the north side of town and one on the south side of town. We're on South 4th Street. They wanted to put a courthouse here and a jail and all of those administrative complexes. Ultimately, the courthouse was built on North 2nd Street, but at the beginning, when this became the county seat, they built the jail here. And it was a wooden jail, literally a 1-story wooden building that they used as the county jail. Now the only problem with that, of course, it wasn't super secure, so it became kind of a problem because there were many breakouts from the jail. So in 1888, they built the brick courthouse on North 2nd Street, and attached to the brick courthouse was a brick jail. So this was no longer really needed to house prisoners, so the county rented it to a man named George Horniker. And eventually George Horniker bought the house, added a 2nd story, and turned it into his living quarters. George Horniker worked for many years as a clerk at the Baldwin store, and when he passed away, his daughter and his son-in-law, the Abbotts, lived in the house. So an interesting story behind the Horniker Abbott jail. We're standing in front of the Farlow Stow House, an interesting property. This was originally built as a small log cabin in 1874. A man named Jack Holbrook built the cabin. He sold it to Ed Farlow, who came to Lander in 1878. Farlow was a cowboy. He worked for the Lamoureux family, Lamoureux being an even earlier settler in the Lander Valley. Farlow ended up marrying Lizzie Lamoureux, who was Mr. Lamoureux's daughter, and they expanded the house behind us over the years. Farlow was very active in the Lander community, particularly in getting the Lander Parade and Lander Pioneer Days established. Many of these early houses we're looking at were essentially out in the country. Lander was concentrated very much along the Poposia River and basically ended at 3rd Street. So the further north you went, the more spread out things got and the more isolated houses were. This area was actually known as Farlow's Grove. It was a big open area with lots of shade trees, and there were lots of community events held here. The Farlows would hold band concerts here at Farlow's Grove. The Lander Community Band was very active. Farlow was also very active in the Lander Pioneer Association, the Pioneer Association being a group that was formed by Lander pioneers to preserve Lander's history. And the Farlows would host the annual picnic here at Farlow's Grove for many years for the Pioneer Association. The Pioneer Association eventually were instrumental in getting the Lander Pioneer Museum built, which we have a fantastic facility today thanks to the foresight of those early pioneers. Hi, we're standing in front of the Samuel Conant Parks house, which was built in 1892. Samuel Parks was a significant figure in the early development of Lander. As a matter of fact, he was described by the Lander newspaper as intimately connected to development in this town for over 60 years. Did a lot for the community. He was born in Illinois, got a degree in economics from the University of Michigan, and a PhD in economics from a university in Germany. He came to Lander in 1888 and co-founded the first Lander Bank and was vice president of the bank. And then he was president until he passed away on Christmas Day in 1944. Parks also founded banks in Cody, Thermopolis. He was involved in the Lander Electric Light and Power Company and the Long Creek Sheep Company. We'll hear that a lot about sheep being a big economic factor in Lander's early history. Parks was a primary figure in getting a public library built for Lander. When industrialist Andrew Carnegie was building his libraries all across the country, Parks was asked to see if he could get Carnegie to help pay for a library here in Lander. And Parks set to work and did a lot of correspondence with Carnegie and his company, and eventually got Carnegie to agree to build the very beautiful Lander Public Library. That was built in 1908. Parks served on the library board of directors for many years, and as a matter of fact, he spent many evenings, most of his life, at the library reading and studying because he felt that that was a good way to improve himself. Parks also taught economics at the University of Wyoming and was a trustee for the University of Wyoming as well. Parks was instrumental in helping getting Bishop Randall Hospital built in Lander. He helped raise the money and helped raise money for the doctors and the staff at the hospital. His wife Clara was very prominent in Lander social circles and community activities. She headed many clubs. This home was actually hosted many of the club's activities throughout the town, particularly the Lander Musical Research Group. They were a group of people who studied and played music, and they met here often throughout the years at the Parks House. If we went back to the founding of Lander, it would look very different. Today we see many tall, stately, very mature trees growing here in the Lander Valley. Over 100 years ago, that wasn't the case. When the first pioneers got to Lander, there were no trees here. As a matter of fact, Dr. McGee, who is one of the early visitors to the Lander Valley, said that there wasn't even a shrub growing in town except along the river. So the pioneers, when they started building a community, planted trees. They planted them for a variety of reasons. They planted them for shade. They planted them for windbreaks. They planted fruit trees for food. They also planted trees to make the town look pretty, look handsome, and that is clearly the case today with all these beautiful trees that line our residential streets. Many of the early trees that were planted here in the Lander Valley came from a man called Ed Young. Ed Young came to Lander very early, had a ranch out in Red Canyon. He was very interested in trees, particularly fruit trees. He planted very large orchards and grew some of the best apples, as a matter of fact, the only apples in Wyoming for many years. But Ed Young was also interested in other trees as well, and he cultivated cottonwood trees to grow tall and straight. And many of the cottonwood trees that you see, like the ones behind me, were planted here or purchased from Ed Young to plant in the community of Lander. Cottonwoods do very well here in Wyoming, and many of the houses and the residential streets around Lander have these tall cottonwood trees growing. They are well over 100 years old, many of them, and they came from Ed Young's orchards and nurseries out in Red Canyon. We're standing in front of the Jackson Park edition of Lander. This is on South 3rd Street. Jackson Park was considered a very desirable residential location. It was one of many developments in the history of Lander. There was the Amoretti edition, the Dickinson edition, and the Lowe edition. The Jackson Park edition comes a little bit later in the history. It comes after 1906. Between 1906 and 1920, Lander experienced a considerable boom. The railroad coming to town made an enormous economic impact in the town. The opening of much of the land on the Wind River Reservation to settlement helped bring a lot of people and businesses to the area. The coal industry was going very well, and the sheep industry was enormous because of World War I. And the sheep industry was enormous in this area. Many of these very nice homes were built with money made by people running sheep or owning sheep operations. Wool was in high demand because of World War I, and the prices for wool were very, very high. A lot of money was made in this area raising sheep primarily for their wool, which, because there was a railroad in town now, was very easy to ship to markets in other parts of the country. The Jackson Park edition is a more modern edition. Most of these houses are built in the craftsman bungalow style, which became very popular during that period of time. If you walk around the residential neighborhoods of Lander, you'll see a wide variety of architectural styles. Many of the homes are late Victorian style, a few Queen Anne style homes. The craftsman bungalow style, which became popular in the teens and 20s, are what some of the houses behind me are designed after. Lots of different architectural styles in Lander. We're standing in front of the Alexander Scotty Johnston house, which was built in 1917. Like many Lander folks, Scotty Johnston was an immigrant. He came to Wyoming from Scotland. Johnston acquired a large ranch out on Twin Creek and started a sheep operation out there. Became one of the largest sheep operations in the area. He and his brother eventually merged and created the Johnston Brothers Sheep Company. Johnston had a home out on Twin Creek, but he had this home built in Lander so that they could winter in Lander and his kids could go to the Lander public schools, which were very highly regarded at the time because they were providing a good education. Johnston's first wife, Agnes, died in 1918 from the influenza epidemic, and he remarried later on and had a number of other children. Johnston was very active in the community. He was a board member for the Fremont County Vocational High School for many years. We're standing in front of the Leslie Reed house, which was built in 1919. Leslie Reed was the grandson of Noyes Baldwin, so he grew up as a clerk in the Baldwin store. Eventually, Reed went out on his own and opened Oswald and Reed Men's Furnishing Store. They sold men's clothing and shoes, but they also sold saddles and ropes. Reed was the Lander director for the Pioneer Days celebration for many years and a very active member in the Lander Commercial Club, which was a precursor to the Lander Chamber of Commerce. We're standing in front of the Brower home on South 3rd. This was built in 1919. Frank Brower came to Lander in 1888 and he did a little bit of everything. He started out as a mule skinner, he was a bartender for a while, very, very energetic young man. Eventually opened the Brower Lumber Yard and made a considerable amount of money in the burgeoning town of Lander, providing lumber and bricks for the building of the town. Brower, like many Lander businessmen, also got involved in the sheep industry and created one of the largest sheep herds in the area. He eventually wanted to concentrate on the lumber business, so he sold his sheep operation for $100,000, which was, again, an astronomical amount of money in those days. He had this house built in 1919. It's a beautiful arts and crafts style house. Very, very well appointed, has oak finishings, oak baseboards, has stained glass windows, a large wraparound porch. Brower was also president of the Lander Commercial Club, and he was also the mayor of Lander when he died in 1927. We're standing in front of the H.O. Barber House on South 3rd Street. This house was built in 1916. It's an imposing structure, certainly the largest house of any kind in the whole county at that time. H.O. Barber came to Fremont County in 1906. He followed the railroad out and had a job as a railroad clerk at the railroad depot in Shoshone. Barber was a smart businessman and started investing very early in the coal mines that were opening outside of Hudson. Barber made a lot of money in the coal industry. He also invested in a number of lumber yards. He opened a big lumber yard in Hudson. He also was part owner of a lumber yard here in Lander. Made a lot of money in his day. Barber was also interesting because he realized the tourism potential of Lander very early. He came up with the idea for the Noble Hotel. He felt that if there was a very high-end motel or hotel in Lander, people would come on the train, stay at the hotel, and then travel from Lander up into Yellowstone. So Barber and Fred Noble and a number of others invested in the Noble Hotel, which at its time was a very, very swanky place to stay. And again, tourists would come into Lander on the train. They would stay in the Pullman cars. They would go to the Noble Hotel and stay, and then they would be taken to Yellowstone in motor coaches and stay at a variety of lodges on the way. They would stay at Du Bois, they would stay at Togety Pass, they would stay at Jackson Lake. There were lodges set up for those tourists the entire way. Barber was very instrumental in convincing the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad to add Pullman cars to their line coming into Lander, so that gave tourists a very comfortable way to get to Lander. Then they would stay at the hotel, and then they would take the motor coaches up into Grand Teton and into Yellowstone. Barber made a lot of money in his various fields, and he invested a lot of it in his house. The house behind me cost $85,000 in 1916, which is an astronomical sum of money. Later in his life, Barber did run into financial difficulties, and he lost a lot of money and actually had to leave Lander. He ended up running a hotel in Las Vegas for a while. He took a trip to Hawaii when he was 53 years old in 1929. His health was failing at that point, and on his way back from Hawaii, he passed away. The Barber House did pass to several different owners, and actually for a period of time in the 1970s served as a mortuary as well. We're looking at the Earl Building on Main Street in Lander. Not everybody in Lander lived in a standalone house. There were apartments, and some of them very nice. Fred Earl had a spacious and luxurious apartment in the second story of this building. Earl came to Lander in 1887 from Sackett's Harbor, New York at the age of 17. He got into the sheep business quickly and made a lot of money. By the time he was 30, he was rich enough not to have to work unless he wanted to, which his wife said he often did. He married Mary Lamoureux, whose family was one of the earliest in the Lander Valley. With his money from the sheep industry, Earl built the Earl Building in 1907. On the lower floor, he opened the City Drug Store, and a few years later, he co-founded the Stock Growers Bank, which was also on the first floor of the Earl Building. Earl was an astute stock trader and made a fortune playing the stocks. He saw the crash coming and sold all of his shares in the market before the Great Depression and came through that dark time with his fortune intact. He was very active in the development of Lander. He divorced his wife Mary and then remarried several more times, spending his winters in California or Florida, but returning to Lander in the summer. His two daughters, the first of whom he had when he was 67, loved living in the downtown apartment where they could visit all the local businesses. We're standing in front of the Park Hayes house on Amoretti Street in the Amoretti Addition, which was built in 1908. Park Hayes came to Wyoming in 1897, originally settling in Casper to run an oil industry newspaper. He was a newspaper man. He moved to the Lander area in 1906 to take over the Wind River Mountaineer, which was the Lander Valley newspaper. Eventually, he also acquired the Lander Clipper, which became the Wyoming State Journal. He built this beautiful house in 1908, and at that time, again, there weren't a lot of houses around here. This was kind of an isolated area. If you look at some early pictures of the area, there aren't any other houses around except for the Hayes house, which clearly dominated the area. His wife Alice was very active in Lander community. She had hosted many social clubs, many musical events, many literary events at their house, and they were a very, very prominent family and very active in the Lander community. In 1917, Park Hayes got out of the newspaper business and started working for the United States Post Office. He actually worked for the post office as assistant postmaster for the rest of his life. Hi, we're standing on South 3rd Street in front of the Fred Noble House, which was built in 1893. Fred Noble came to Lander from Sackett's Harbor, New York, and he started out as a clerk at the Indian Agency at Fort Washakie. He got into the sheep business with John Carmody, who was a very prominent sheep herder in this area, made an enormous amount of money in the sheep business. He was also involved in the coal industry around Hudson, and with H.O. Barber, he partnered with the Brower Lumber Company. He also partnered with Brower and a number of other people to create the Noble Hotel. Fred Noble had one son whose name was Everett, and unfortunately he died at a very young age from appendicitis. And Fred had no other children. He wanted to leave some kind of legacy, so he insisted that the Noble Hotel be named the Noble Hotel in honor of his son Everett. Fred built this late Victorian style home in 1893. It's actually a brick structure that was later stuccoed over. Many of the homes in Lander are made of brick. Brick signified that you had wealth, and they obviously a very sturdy building material for Wyoming's winds and winter. There were actually 3 brick operations running in the Lander Valley, so there were lots of bricks available. Noble was also active in the Lander community. He was on the school board for many years and was involved in many of the projects, including Bishop Randall Hospital. He helped get that established and built. He eventually retired to California for his health, and he died there in California in the 1940s.